I can tell you what you do with money can buy you happiness, whether that be for selfish and personal reasons or for philanthropic reasons. If that doesn't make you happy, then you got to check your pulse. And if you think you can do that without money, you don't get it.
You're listening to the Elevate Podcast, and I'm your host, Robert Glazer. Join me as I talk to world-class performers about how they build their capacity and reach greater heights in leadership, business, and life, and how you can do the same. Welcome to the Elevate Podcast. Our quote for today is from Natalie Clifford Barney. Entrepreneurship is the last refuge of the troublemaking individual. My guest today, John Lee Dumas, who goes by JLD, is an entrepreneur's entrepreneur. He's the founder and host of the award-winning podcast, Entrepreneurs on Fire, a podcast with over 1 million monthly downloads that has featured guests such as Tony Robbins, Tim Ferriss, Barbara Corcoran, and Gary Vaynerchuk. He's also the author of several books, including The Common Path to Uncommon Success, The Freedom Journal, and The 100-Day Goal Journal. JLD, welcome. It's great to have you on the Elevate Podcast.
RG, JLD here. Excited to be here. Prepared to ignite.
All right. So we'll move from acronyms so people can know what we're talking about. Entrepreneurial realm. I like to start early. So what was your childhood like? Were you like selling notes, lemonade stand? Was this something very, very present very early for you?
I am what I like to call a Gary V 180 because I was the opposite of Gary Vaynerchuk growing up. And I kind of remain that way to this day, to be honest. So you can really be successful no matter where you are on the spectrum. I didn't have an entrepreneurial fiber in my body. I would mow one lawn every 2 weeks for $40 because that's all the money that I needed. I had people asking me to mow their lawn. I was like, why? I don't need any more money than I'm making right now. And I don't want to trade any more time for that money. So I was just not entrepreneurial. I did no entrepreneurial ventures. I was like, how can I put the least amount of effort into school, the most amount of effort into sports, and the most amount of effort into just fun? That was my focus for literally the first 22 years of my life, because that really lasted throughout college. So I grew up in Maine, loved it. Small.
Where in Maine?
Very southern Maine, a town next to Kennebunk called Alfred, Maine.
Okay, I know Kennebunk.
Beautiful little area.
Beautiful, yeah.
And then after 18 years of living there, I got an Army scholarship to go to college in Rhode Island at a little school called Providence College, Go Friars, where I spent 4 years as a ROTC cadet, so training to become an officer. And that was my first 22 years of my life. Was a small town boy going to a bigger city, because Providence, Rhode Island is a pretty small city compared to the behemoths of like New York City, Chicago, Boston, etc. But it's still a city. And so that was a cool experience to do that. And, I learned a lot, but mostly I did not do anything entrepreneurial because that just wasn't my vibe.
So you served for 8 years. What are some of the enduring lessons from that experience that kind of, when you did become an entrepreneur, we'll get into that, kind of shaped who you are today and how you work and how you run your business and life?
So the second journal that I wrote in 2017 is called The Mastery Journal, which is all about productivity, discipline, and focus. And I know you love acronyms. Yeah. And so the word focus is an acronym for follow one course until success. And those really are the three things that the military taught me over my 8 years as an officer in the U.S. Army: was how to be productive, how to be disciplined, and how to be focused. And I spent 13 months in Iraq as a tank commander. So I was in charge of 16 men in 4 tanks in a wartime environment. So you better believe when it comes down to being a life or death scenario, which it was every day for me for 13 months, you really start taking those things seriously.
And so I know in 2009, you left the military and you kind of bounced around a bit till you figured out what you wanted to do. I know today that seems almost sacrosanct to not know what we want to do, maybe fail a little bit. Can you walk me through sort of that period of discovery and what ultimately led you to podcasting and then to the format that became Entrepreneurs on Fire?
Well, what do you mean it seems sacrosanct to not know what you want to do?
I feel like, with the way that a lot of kids are raised today, it's always about what's next. Even, they go to college and then it's like, okay, well, what about the internship? And there's just not a lot of place for discovery or bouncing around. People go hide in school and buy expensive degrees because that has more prestige than trying to figure out what you like and what you want to do and trying some things. So I make that as a generalization.
And so what was the question?
So the question was, after you left, you bounced around a bit and trying to figure things out for that point in your life. Like what led you to eventually to the podcasting and to EO Fire?
It was actually what I like to call 6 years of struggle. And I'm genuine when I say that. I mean, it was a
Yeah.
struggle. I got out of the military. I tried a lot of things. I tried corporate finance. I tried law school. I tried commercial real estate, residential real estate. I was bopping around to these.
Those are very different. Yeah.
Very different. I was tasting them all. And none of them tasted very good for very long periods of time. I liked all of them at some level for some length of time, but they all kind of ended up turning sour in my mouth for one reason or another over, a short period of time, at most like 18 months, sometimes as short as 3 or 4 months, to be honest. And that's just kind of what I was doing for those 6 years. I was bopping around. I was trying things. I was failing. I was struggling. I was watching my luckily very healthy savings accounts because I went to college for free on an Army scholarship. I had spent, 4 years as an active duty officer and then another 4 years in the reserves. So I had over $100,000 in the bank for just a single guy with not very much in living expenses. It allowed me to try those things and allowed me to test those things, but that's not a dollar amount that will last forever. And I was seeing that dollar amount continuously dwindle, and that's never exciting or encouraging. And so I knew at some point I was going to have to figure something out.
Were you frustrated, or was it fun to try these different things? Like, were you enjoying learning all this stuff, or if we look back, would parents and friends have been like, what is this guy doing? Like, he's a mess. He doesn't know what he wants to do or otherwise. Do you kind of remember where you were at that point?
Yeah, I think at graduation of college and maybe even when I got out of the military, I might have been voted like most likely to succeed by my friends and family. And then within 2 or 3 years, it had completely flipped on its head. And would have likely been voted most likely to fail because they went from, okay, John's just going from strength to strength to John's a mess. He can't figure things out. He's dropping out of law school. He's walking away from a 6-figure corporate finance job in the middle of a recession. He's trying to sell residential real estate. I mean, like, what is he doing? And they were right. Like, what was I doing? I didn't know, but I knew that I had to keep searching if I was going to find what I really wanted to do, that I was both going to love and that I was going to make a lot of money doing. Because that was always a huge goal. I was like, I want to be very wealthy. I want to be rich. I want to live in a beautiful house. I want to not be worried about money on a month-to-month basis. I want to be able to do fun things, to be able to be very generous in a philanthropic sense. Like, I wanted all those things. And, people say money can't buy happiness. Well, I can tell you what you do with money can buy you happiness, whether that be for selfish and personal reasons or for philanthropic reasons. I mean, I've written massive checks to organizations that I love that are doing amazing things, like building schools in Guatemala, that I've gone down to the ribbon cutting ceremony of and seeing a school at a place that never existed before, and the kids and the mothers crying and the teachers like so excited. Like, if that doesn't make you happy, then you got to check your pulse. And if you think you can do that without money, you don't get it.
So what led you to the podcast, and like, how did you first episode, like, take me through that? What year was this?
2012. I'm consuming.
Okay. So podcasts are like nascent at this point. Yeah.
Nascent. And I am consuming all forms of content on the business side of things, trying to figure something out. I'm going to Amazon and I'm Googling best business books, and I'm buying all of them. They're getting shipped in huge boxes because this is before I even had a Kindle. So I'm getting the hardcovers of like Rich Dad, Poor Dad and Think and Grow Rich. And I remember these boxes showing, and I was actually living at my parents at the time. And they were like, what is this stuff? And I'm like, my dad was always a big reader. So like, he was encouraging it, but at the same time, he's like, what do you like, are you just going to read, or you can actually do something too? And I'm like, well, let me read. And long story short, that led me to like finding Audible and tools like that and listening to the audiobooks. But all that gets expensive, like buying books and audiobooks. And I was like, well, is there any free content out there? And that's when I stumbled across the platform of podcasting. And right away, it just clicked with me. Like I got it. I understood that this was a free, on-demand and targeted platform. That's irresistible when people get it because it's free. It doesn't cost you anything. It's on
Yeah.
demand. You press play and pause when you want to, and it's targeted. You listen to what you want to listen to. I mean, that is such an amazing value proposition. And I knew that if I could create amazing content for a platform like this, that I would win on some level. And I kind of did my research because I'm a huge believer in the phrase, which I actually based my entire book around that you mentioned, The Common Path to Uncommon Success. Create the number one solution to a real problem. And if you can do that, you will win. So I kind of took that
Yeah.
mentality to podcasting and I said, how can I create the number one solution to a real problem? Well, I can launch a podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. But guess what? There's 10 podcasts at that time that were publishing podcasts that were interviews with entrepreneurs. There were 10 of them.
Any of them around today?
Yeah. Pat Flynn, Smart Passive Income.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Andrew
Yeah.
Warner, Mixergy. Those might be the only two that are still around.
Okay.
Another couple were like David Siteman Garland's Rise to the Top. That's no longer around. And there were a handful of others. And I said, well, I'm not going to be the number one solution to this problem because it's already being solved. But what are they not doing that may still be a problem that I can solve better than them, or a problem that they're ignoring? And it honestly came down to quantity because I would listen to Pat Flynn interview some amazing entrepreneur. And back then his cadence was once every 2 weeks. And I was like, wow, he did 37 episodes. It took him a year to do that, a year. And so I went through his back catalog in a couple weeks and then I was caught up. And then after I listened to an episode, it was like, I have to wait 2 more weeks for another episode. Like I need one every single day. And there was not a show that existed that did that. So I said, that's the opportunity. That's the void that I can fill. That is the niche that I can dominate. That is the real problem that I can become the number one solution to. And so I launched Entrepreneurs on Fire. And the day that I launched, it was the best daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. It was the worst daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. It was the only daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. And guess what? I was the only show in town. I'm like, back in the day, you live in a small town in the Midwest, there's one Blockbuster. You want to go rent video from them? You're going to Blockbuster. You don't have a choice, even if they're terrible. So I wasn't a great host. Luckily, my early guests were great and they carried the show. And I was smart enough to just ask very short, concise questions and step out of the way and let them give the value. And it worked.
So at this point, you've done thousands of interviews with top entrepreneurs. Like, what are some of the commonalities that you've seen and that you've then said, all right, I got to make sure to apply this to what is your own entrepreneurial journey at this point in building a business?
Being successful in the military is very similar to being successful as an entrepreneur. And the only difference is usually it's not life and death for entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Where it can be if you're in the military, especially like me, deployed to a war zone for 13 months. So I really go back and I say, listen, entrepreneurs have at least one of these three qualities. Many have two, and the most successful have all three. And that is productivity, discipline, focus. So productivity. What does that actually mean? Because so many people think they're productive. They're like, John, oh my God,
they're busy. They're not productive.
Yeah. Today. I ran and I did this and I was on that and I did all these things. And I'm like, you're just being busy. Like you're not being productive, because productive means, in my definition, you are producing the right content for your business. So right now I'm being productive with my time because this is one of the activities I consider productive for me, producing this type of content. Tomorrow, I have 6 interviews with guests of Entrepreneurs on Fire. back to back to back, 6 episodes. And I do that
Wow.
every single Thursday.
So you group them up and do them on one day.
Batch like a baller. There's no other
Yeah.
way to do it. Produce the right content. That's when you're being productive. Discipline. Discipline means you have a plan of action every day and you are a disciple to that plan of action. You are not going to not accomplish that plan. And I always love to say, win tomorrow today. You should know what your tomorrow's plan is already today. Because if you wait till the tomorrow version of you wakes up in the morning and yawns, and stretches, and feels a little cobwebby, that's not the person you want setting the plan for the day. You want the best version of you, which is maybe the 10 a.m. or the 12 p.m. or the 2 p.m. version of you planning the next day. So win tomorrow today. And then focus. Again, the acronym. Follow one course until success. Brother, I've seen it all. I've seen so many people have something and they're working towards success. They're digging towards that gold nugget. And then boom, they get distracted by this bright, shiny object syndrome and they're off to the races and they lose it. They just lose it and it never comes back.
Well, one thing that's interesting too, we've all seen like the ikigai chart, right? The how you make money, what you love, what the world needs, kind of the intersection. So I tell this story where 2 years ago, I released a book and I did a podcast tour, kind of in the fervor of podcasts, COVID, everything. And some really well-known people had launched podcasts. And 18 months later, I had another book. I went around to all these same people and half of them weren't doing their podcast anymore.
At least.
And they had put time, money, and effort. Now, I think they were maybe doing it for the wrong reasons. It's kind of like someone having a kid to harvest organs to save the other kid. That's an extreme example, but people doing it for their business, not for the right reasons, expecting a quick result. I think one of the things that you've done well is, and early on, probably before there was an industry, it exists now, was you thought about monetization and advertising and sponsorship and different things. And you said, look, this is my craft. How do I make a living out of it? I think a lot of people, somehow their craft and their passion is detached from the sustainable engine of making money and making a living. And when you don't do that for a while, when we've had a decade of businesses that don't know how to make money, it's not a switch you can flip easily.
People that think that their podcast that they listen to should not have sponsorships or that the sponsorships are annoying and the host should remove them are idiots. They're just idiots because they don't realize that that individual is spending tens, if not 30s to 40s to not 60s of hours a week on that craft to produce an unbelievable amount of value. And if 5% of that content is going to fund the other 95% of the free value, then shut your mouth, consume the sponsorship, support them when you can by actually following the
or pay for it, right?
Promo code.
Yeah.
Or there's podcasts that go out there and do premiums where there's ad-free options as well, which, whatever. Tim Ferriss tried that and failed miserably. So, I mean, even the top show like Tim Ferriss couldn't pull that off to the same level that he could.
Oh, I missed that. He tried to switch to a premium.
Yeah, he was very public about it. It was probably 6 or 7 years ago. And it was as everything he does, he, plays it out as a test because it allows you to backtrack pretty easy if you need.
And he'll tell you if it doesn't work. Yeah.
And it did not work. People were not willing to pay $5 a month for ad free. And this is even on the Tim Ferriss show, which he does sponsorships terribly wrong. I've tried to help him in the past.
He probably makes so much money that he can be wrong. And look, would you argue that the longer you go without establishing that, I think people have waited maybe too long, and then it's like, you're running ads. It's annoying.
Of that. So I started as soon as I could. I was having sponsors on my show, so people really only knew my show with sponsors. Pat Flynn was seeing my income reports after a couple of years, and he's like, brother, like, I got to figure this out. Like, that's some real money I'm leaving on the table. And so he implemented sponsorships, and he got super backlash from a lot of his listeners, not everybody, but those idiots that I already previously mentioned. He got some backlash from those individuals. And it was tough because, that's tough to get a lot of backlash from your community, even when they are idiots. And, going back to just to finish the Tim Ferriss thing, what he does terribly wrong is his sponsorships are so long at the beginning of the episode. They're like 3, 4, sometimes 5 minutes long.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that he's
People skip it.
training his listeners to just fast forward to what some reasonable beginning part of the show. That again, and his shows aren't that, he takes a while to get going too. So his shows aren't that interesting at the beginning either. So people don't even really care if they fast forward a little too far. The key is, if you really want to maximize the win-win-win, which is the win for the host, the win for the sponsor, and the win for the listener, is you've got to have real value almost right away. I call it the fat finger rule. Like if it's a little too annoying to fast forward because you kind of go a little too far, you try to go back a little bit, then you've got it right. So for me, it's 2 15-second pre-rolls. So 30 seconds of sponsorships at the beginning, which are, by the way, preceded with a teaser of the episode of like some really cool content that's coming. Then a quick 30-second block of sponsorships. Then boom, I'm into the content with a really awesome question that I ask at the very beginning of every show that my listeners don't want to miss. And so I'm training them to say, listen, maybe I don't want to listen to the sponsorships, but it's not worth me trying to skip over them because they're come and gone so fast anyways. And then they listen to them and they consume the content. Yeah. And then, when they decide that it's time to hire somebody, they go to ZipRecruiter.com/fire. And now I have an 8-year sponsorship track with them because of stuff like that.
There's a really important lesson in here. And I think the free capital of the last decade has obfuscated this lesson. And then again, the sooner you try to figure out your value or figure out the formula, that's how you get to the win-win. Again, a lot of these businesses haven't charged customers. So food delivery, grocery delivery, perfect example, I always say. At 10%, everyone's willing to do it, right? It's a money loser at 10%. They can't make money at a 10% surcharge. At 40%, that probably funds the business sustainably. 80% or less people aren't going to do it. They're going to go pick it up, right? At a 40% premium. So until you want to figure that out, you can charge the 10% and lose money for a while, but it's not going to be clean when you go you should probably try to figure out what the magic number is, where you can get sponsorship, how to make it work before you have to, because when you have to, it's not so easy. All right. So you've interviewed a lot of people. How many guests have you had?
4,364.
And you talk about being the best. I think you're over 100 million downloads. We talked
I'm
about
also the worst, but I'm the
what?
I'm the only.
Yeah, the only. Puts you in top 0.1%.
Listen, I'm the best daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs, but I'm the only one doing that. So that is why I'm a category of one. And that's
still no one's jumped into it.
People have tried for extended periods of times, but they've never been able to maintain it. That's a great book.
It's easier to do it for a month than it is to do it for years.
Because again, remember I went back to that Pat Flynn thing. He had done 37 episodes in a year.
Yeah.
By day 45, I had passed him in his total episodes when I launched. I had 45 episodes done, and he was still at 40. Like it was like that's the difference of quantity. And plus, brother, I was a bad interviewer. I was a poor host. I was a bad speaker, communicator, facilitator of conversations, all of those things. I had no experience. Why would everybody's bad when they started that, any new skill, but doing it 7 days a week surely got me faster a lot quicker. Like, do you think Kobe Bryant practiced basketball 4 days a month? I don't think so.
All right. So you have 4,000 guests. Who's the one you were most starstruck or surprised that they said yes? And then how did you prepare for that?
I wouldn't use the word starstruck, but I will use the word celebrity struck. Because this is the one where my dad's like, are you serious? Because for him, it was a big deal. And for me, of course, I'd heard of this guy, but I didn't grow up with him because he was before my time, really. But it was Gene Simmons of Kiss. And he was writing a book called Me Inc. And, shockingly, it was mostly about him. And he's a very egotistical, misogynist individual. Terrible interview, by the way, like really bad. But I had to kind of get fired up for that one because, he has such a big team and I was going through all these, they reached out to me. I never even would have thought to reach out to him.
Yeah.
But they have all these handlers and it was a whole thing. And I had to I always like, have people go on my schedule no matter what. Cause I'm like, this is my studio day. This is when it's happening. But I was like, it was like a Monday. And I mean, I was just like out of sorts, and he was hours late and the whole thing. And it was interesting.
So you talked a little bit about this. You have this formula, you've stayed with it, but obviously things change. Podcasting has evolved a ton since you've started. So we know you've done the same. What have you had to change or do differently to kind of stay ahead or stay sharp, or, again, up your own game, even though you don't have direct competition?
So I'm on episode 4,364. For the
To be
first
exact.
2,000 episodes, I asked 6 questions. That was the podcast for 2,000 episodes. At that point, at episode 2,000, of course, leading up to it, I was feeling like, okay, it's time for a change because it served me well thus far. It had been about 5 years or however long it was, give or take. No, even more than that, like more like 6, maybe 6.5 years. And I said, it's time for a change. And so I decided episode 2000 to sunset the 6 questions.
6 questions, yeah.
And shift to what is still the format today, which is essentially I have my guests write the interview flow, meaning they have an area of expertise, whatever it might be. I have them propose a title. I have them propose 4 to 6 bullet points they feel most qualified to talk about. Because again, this all goes back to how can I make my show unbelievably valuable for my listener? Not by asking, for my guest's life story, because that can be interesting, but is it really valuable for most people at most times? No. But like, is a guest in like a short, most of my interviews are 17 to 23 minutes. So in a really tight, concise 17 to 23 minutes episode, if I can deliver 6 unbelievable value bombs that my guest is uniquely positioned to drop.
And they're going to know that they're going to know which things they're most positioned on, right?
Exactly. Because it's a whole application process. So I know that episode will be as valuable as possible in adherence to my goal, which is my guest sharing their area of expertise in a very concise and valuable way. So right now we get about between 400 to 500 inquiries per month of people wanting to be on the show for the 30 spots. Of that, we send people to a page, which is eofire.com/guest. And that guest page shares everything about Entrepreneurs on Fire, what the application process is, as well as the fact that there's a $3,500 appearance fee to be a guest on the show. So that immediately weeds out people who I call are not.
And you're not shy about that,
no.
Right? Again, you're here to make a living. Yeah.
And that weeds out who I like to call people who are not Entrepreneurs on Fire. Because guess what? I call my show Entrepreneurs on Fire.
Yeah.
I want to be interviewing entrepreneurs who are on fire. If you're an entrepreneur that cannot afford $3,500 for the exposure you're going to get on one of the biggest business podcasts in the world, then it's not the right fit. I'm not saying it wouldn't be a good show, but you need to go make some more money. You need to go be more financially successful. If that dollar amount,
knowing your audience,
there's some people who can afford it and just don't.
And by the way, there's still more people that are willing to pay that. Then it sounds like you have slots, right?
Yes, and so then there's still a 5-minute video conference that I do with them. I actually have 2 of those today, with prospective individuals who have applied, want to be on the show, want to pay, but I've got to make sure they've got the right personality, the right energy, and we go a little deeper on the topic too to make sure it's the right topic.
Yeah. So just to point out, I don't get 500. I get a lot of inbound. When you're trying to get into something where there's a lot of demand as an entrepreneur, otherwise you hire these PR firms, these outreach firms, assume someone on the other side, and they get 100 of the same stock messages every day, you are probably better off putting some real work into customizing 2 or 3 of these things than this is like throwing your application in with 10,000 people to a job where it's going to be luck. I am surprised that all these services and that people hire do such a poor job. And they can do that in cases where there's more supply than demand, but where there's more demand than supply, spending some time to stand out. There
It's
was a
even
guest.
more embarrassing
Yeah,
in the day and age of Chat GPT, where it's
yeah,
so easy to go there and just say, "Hey, make the perfect podcast pitch for Robert Glazer,"
yeah,
and then they're literally in 500 words, and then they're gonna know everything about you because of course they're gonna everything that's on the internet, of course, and Chat GPT will craft a perfect pitch for you. Like, is it going to be like perfect? Of course not.
yeah.
It's still going to look a little.
Right. Use the tools for personalization
Ew.
rather than mass customization. I've shared the story before, but I haven't shared the name, so I'll say it here. But the person I really want on the podcast years ago is Angela Duckworth, and I had reached out to her a couple of times, and she had kind of brushed me off. Again, assume that Angela is someone who gets asked to be on 100 podcasts for every 1 or 2 that she has the time to do. So I was like, you know what? I'm just not going to send the same thing. So I spent a couple hours deeply researching her work. I was a huge fan of her book. I found a bunch of insights, and I said, Angela, if you come on, here are the questions that I want to ask you. They were 10 pretty deep questions about her background and thoughtful and other. And I spent 2 hours on this as sort of a risk on my time. Not only did she reply and agree to be on the podcast, but she told me she used it as an example in her class on how to try to stand out when you're asking for something. So we have, as you said, we have these great tools available. Don't use it to do 1,000 generic things. Like, use it to do 1 or 2 things that matters.
So I've spoken at countless conferences, and one thing that I do share very often is what I call the perfect podcast pitch. Because a lot of people are saying, John, how do I get on other big podcasts?
Yeah.
And I share the entire script. It's an amazing script. It is crafted beautifully. Of course, I recommend people to tweak it and to personalize it to make it.
Is it on your website?
It's on my website. Okay. And I'll also send it to you after if you want to put in the show notes.
Yeah, send it because we'll include a link to it in the show notes.
And it's the perfect podcast pitch. And I still
no one sends it to you.
3 to this day that have used that format. I have gone 3, but it's staggering. Like, it's staggering. People just
it's kind of amazing. An equivalence here is people reach out all the time and they're like, hey, I see your friend John has a job and for free. Do you mind making an intro? And it's like, sure, just send me the sentence that you want to send. And then they send me some crap that I have to edit, and they just make it really hard. The last time, again, similarly, there was a guest I wanted on my show. This guest was on a friend of my show. I wrote the entire thing that she could cut and paste that made her look really good. Hey, whoever, this person heard you on my show, has a big show, huge following, would love to have you on it. Are you okay? All she had to do was cut and paste. Like people appreciate when they see you doing the work rather than asking them to do the work.
I especially appreciate it when they write it in
in your voice. Right, exactly.
Because when somebody writes, I'm like, I have to go through now this entire thing and change all like the little adverbs and adjectives and all the different things. I'm just like, that's just, come on.
I've never had someone actually tell me they wouldn't make the intro after I wrote it completely in their voice, did all the work, made a copy, and I made them look good in the process of sending it. So we're getting low on time here, but I want to make sure, you wrote this Freedom Journal, which focuses on accomplishing goals in 100 days. I wanted to ask you, like, for an example of one you used that maybe you didn't think at the beginning that you could do that, but what is the significance of the 100 days?
So 100 days is pretty meaningful because it allows you to accomplish a very meaningful goal, but in a reasonable amount of time. Because a lot of people, they set, these New Year's resolution goals, and immediately they're just like thinking, oh man, I have a year to accomplish this. And then before they know it, it's December 25th, and they're like, what happens? So like when you have too long of a time to accomplish a goal, procrastination sets in. When you have too short of a time, you don't give yourself permission to set a lofty, meaningful, audacious goal. But 100 days, you can do it. You're immediately feeling the countdown, 99, 98, 97. It starts to feel real right away. And I set this book up to accomplish the goal in 100 days in a very meaningful and strategic way as well. Whereas every 10 days, you're doing what I call a 10-day sprint. So even right away, even though you have 100 days, you have a micro goal in the first 10 days, which you have the following 90 days as well. So you have 10 micro goals that you're accomplishing every 10 days throughout the book. So you always feel like, I got to do something today because I've got to accomplish this micro goal that's in 7 days, 5 days, 3 days away.
Yeah.
So every 10 days, there's a micro goal you're setting. And then every 25 days, you do what I call a quarterly review, where you look over your shoulder and you say, what worked? What didn't work? How can I adjust and pivot to make the next 25 days amazing? And then before you know it, you're at day 100, your goal is accomplished, your 10 micro goals are accomplished, your major goal is accomplished, your 3 quarterly reviews, you've learned a lot from them, and you're on to the next Freedom Journal. I have a guy in our Freedom Journal Facebook group who's now done 17 Freedom Journals.
It's the domino effect. Domino can knock down a domino 50% bigger. I think it would take only 27 dominoes to knock down the Empire State Building with that formula. So the difference between that energy going in a million directions or going in one direction. So I would be reticent if I didn't ask you. There are a lot of high-level executives, CEOs, founders listening to the show. Someone in their life says to them, you should start a podcast. Like do a podcast. Good for your business, good for your brand. What advice would you give those people?
I would say that's probably really bad advice from somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. The only reason that you should launch a podcast is because you truly believe that you have the number one solution to a real problem in this world, and you can and want to deliver it in a podcasting format. If that is the case, a podcast is an amazing idea. For the 99% of people where that's not the case, a podcast is a terrible waste of time that will just cause you failure and frustration.
That is excellent advice that I will repeat to people who have asked me, because I think a lot of people should heed that, and it's very direct, and I think it's absolutely true. All right. So last question. This is multivariant. It could be personal or professional. It could be singular or repeated. But what's a mistake that you've made that you've learned the most from?
Not listening to my gut. Like it really is something that's evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. When your spidey
gut
are tingling and you're feeling like something is a little off, there's a reason for that. And that's why we as a species have survived for hundreds of thousands of years, because we've, not all of us, but enough of us to recreate and reproduce, have been able to listen to our guts and not walk out of a cave when a saber-toothed tiger is just beyond the visual darkness of that area. So listening to my gut, like I've made mistakes by not doing that, and I'll make mistakes in the future as well, but hopefully I'll avoid some too.
All right. So where can people learn about you, your work, your podcast? Where's the best place to go?
eofire.com is our headquarters. That's where all the magic happens. We have a great, very valuable newsletter for anybody that wants to become a part of the Fire Nation newsletter. We have a lot of free courses for podcasters about podcasting, about funnels, just about the basics that you really need to succeed as an entrepreneur. And that's on that website as well. And Entrepreneurs on Fire. That's the name of the podcast. If you want to search for that or John Lee Dumas, you'll find Entrepreneurs on Fire on any podcasting platform. And there I am.
All right. JLD, thanks for joining us and sharing your awesome story today. To our listeners, thanks for tuning in to the Elevate podcast today. We'll include links to JLD and his work on the detailed episode page at robertglazer.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow the show to be notified about new episodes and have them downloaded automatically to listen. You can also hit follow on Castbox, Spotify, Pandora, or your favorite podcast player. Thanks again for your support. Until next time, keep elevating.